So, uh, imagine a world where the atmosphere is so dense that it acts almost like, well, a biological compression suit.
Right, like a planetary hyperbaric chamber.
Yeah, exactly. An environment that's so oxygen-rich and, completely shielded from solar radiation that it actually allows human beings to grow to giant proportions.
And build these massive skeletal structures.
Right, and live for centuries. But then imagine that entire planetary ecosystem just exploding from the inside out.
A complete cataclysm.
Totally. Forcing the survivors into these extreme, isolated environments where their bodies have to radically alter their physical appearance. I mean, their height, their skin color, bone density, and doing all of this in just a few generations simply to survive.
I mean, it really sounds like a premise for a science fiction novel, but what we're actually describing today is an alternate framework for human biological history.
Yeah, which is exactly the mission for this deep dive.
Right. We are looking at a model that asks you to take this vast, sprawling timeline of human evolution that, you learned in school and basically crush it down into a tiny, intensely violent window of catastrophic change.
And we are unpacking a highly controversial catastrophist framework today. It's called the Unified Theory of Geologic History, or UTGH, written by Darrell Waters.
Along with a comparative textbook that actually weighs the UTGH against the standard evolutionary model.
Exactly. So our objective here is to map out the dispersion of humanity chronologically.
Right.
We're going to start with a single founding family, follow them radiating outward, in concentric circles across the globe.
And examine those rapid, extreme physical adaptations that produce the sheer diversity of human populations we see today, from skin color to physical dimensions.
It's going to be a wild ride. Because we are doing this by examining how two entirely different groups of scientists can look at the exact same physical evidence. I mean, the same DNA, the same fossils.
The exact same geological strata.
Yeah, and arrive at wildly different conclusions, based entirely on their starting assumptions about time and process.
It's honestly a fascinating study in epistemology, just seeing how paradigms shape scientific interpretation.
It really is. Now, before we get into the actual mechanics of this, I do need to lay down a very clear disclaimer for you listening.
Right, this is important.
We are acting strictly as impartial guides to this material. We are not endorsing the UTGH framework, nor are we, taking sides with the standard model.
We aren't here to validate the theological claims, or any of the politically charged elements that sometimes get attached to these texts, either left-wing or right-wing.
Exactly. Our goal is solely to unpack the fascinating ideas, the claims, and most importantly, the actual biological and geological mechanics proposed in these specific sources.
Because the architecture of the argument is what matters here. We want to understand the how and the why behind these claims, completely regardless of whether you personally accept the premise.
Okay, so let's unpack this. I think the best way to visualize the difference between these two models is to think about a sprawling, deeply branched tree of human diversity.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Right. So the standard model tells us it took millions of years for that tree to grow from a tiny seed. It's like writing an encyclopedia by randomly typing letters over millions of years until words and chapters eventually form through trial and error.
Just waiting for the right random mutations.
Yeah. But the UTGH framework looks at the exact same tree and argues it grew overnight. Not because it evolved from scratch, but because the seed was already a compressed version of the entire tree.
A fully written encyclopedia, basically.
Exactly. And the environment just started highlighting the specific paragraphs needed for survival.
What's really fascinating here is the sheer difference in scale. That's the first massive hurdle you have to get over.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers are staggering.
Right, because we are comparing a 50,000 to 100,000 year timeline just for modern human dispersion, which requires thousands of generations of random genetic drift and mutation.
Against what, a 5,000-year timeline?
Exactly. A 5,000-year timeline requiring only about 200 generations of rapid, environmentally driven expression.
Which, if you were listening to this right now, you are probably immediately skeptical. I mean, 200 generations to get every skin color, every body type, every facial structure on Earth.
It sounds mathematically impossible under the standard model.
Right. So to even begin to understand how that could work mathematically, we have to look at the biological starting point. According to the UTGH, humanity traces back to a single pair.
Adam and Eve.
Yeah, created around 5,607 BC. But the real engine of this theory, where things actually kick into gear, is a massive genetic bottleneck event.
The global flood.
Right. The framework posits that all living humans descend from just 8 survivors on an ark. So that's Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives.
Now, in the standard model, you have these concepts of mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam, right? But they are theoretical genetic ancestors separated by tens of thousands of years.
Right, they never actually met.
Exactly. But the UTGH framework basically collapses them together. It places them literally on the boat. They act as the absolute genetic zero point for all of modern humanity.
Which is wild. And I know exactly what people are shouting at their dashboards right now, which is, how do 8 people repopulate a planet without massive inbreeding defects?
Yeah, that's always the first question.
Because we know today that if a population gets that small, genetic diseases compound, fertility drops, and the population just collapses, how do the sources address the biological reality of a bottleneck that tight?
Well, they address it by redefining the actual state of the genome at the time of the bottleneck. This brings in the concept of the front-loaded genome.
Front-loaded.
All right, right. To understand this, we have to look at the environment those 8 people supposedly came from. The UTGH describes a pre-flood Earth that functioned, as we said earlier, like a hyperbaric chamber.
The biological compression suit.
Exactly. The atmospheric pressure was roughly 1.8 atmospheres.
So almost double what we have today.
Right, and oxygen levels sat at a highly enriched 30 to 35%.
Wow, okay, so everything is super oxygenated.
But most importantly, the theory proposes there was a dense water vapor canopy in the upper atmosphere, and this provided massive shielding from ultraviolet radiation.
Ah, okay. And UV radiation is, it's the primary driver of cellular aging and DNA damage, right? Like
Yeah.
it physically breaks the DNA strands.
Exactly. Over a single lifetime, that damage accumulates as aging, but over generations, it degrades the genome itself. It creates what geneticists call genetic load.
Which is basically just the accumulation of harmful mutations over time.
Precisely. Now, because the pre-flood world had this massive atmospheric shield, the UTGH argues that pre-flood humans suffered near zero mutational damage.
So their DNA was completely pristine.
Pristine. So to answer the inbreeding question, you have to realize that inbreeding only causes birth defects if there are recessive mutated genes hiding in the family bloodline.
Oh, right, because you need 2 bad copies of a gene to express the defect.
Exactly. But if the genome is pristine, with literally zero genetic load, close intermarriage doesn't produce defects. There are simply no errors to compound.
Wow. So it wasn't a blank slate waiting for random mutations to write new traits. It was a massive, undamaged library containing the full, latent genetic potential of the human species.
That's the exact argument.
But here's where it gets really interesting and also a bit tricky. I have to push back here. Because if I have a hard drive packed with brilliant software, I still need an operating system to run the commands.
You need a trigger.
Exactly. What was the command or the mechanism that forced this front-loaded DNA to start expressing such wildly different physical traits in just a few centuries? You can't just say, oh, they adapted. How did they adapt?
The mechanism the sources propose is epigenetic expression, triggered by intense environmental stress.
Okay, epigenetics. Let's break that down for a second.
Sure. So epigenetics is this fascinating field of biology. It studies how your behaviors and your environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work.
So it's not changing the underlying code itself.
Exactly. Unlike genetic mutations, epigenetic changes are reversible and they do not change your DNA sequence. But they can completely change how your body reads that sequence.
It's almost like a volume knob on a stereo,
Yeah.
right? You aren't changing the song, the DNA is the same, but you're turning the bass way up or the treble way down based on, like, the acoustics of the room.
That is a perfect analogy. Biologically, this happens through processes like DNA methylation, where chemical tags literally attach to genes to turn them on or off.
Oh, wow. So the environment literally tags the DNA.
Right. And the sources use a really great analogy here to illustrate the sheer speed of this process. Dog breeding.
Oh, sure.
Think about the immense diversity we see in dogs. From a tiny Chihuahua to a massive Great Dane, the textbook notes that all of this diversity was bred from wolves rapidly.
Right, because breeders didn't wait around millions of years for a, short leg mutation to randomly appear in a wolf population.
Exactly. The genetic potential for different leg lengths, snout shapes, coat thicknesses, it was already latent in the wolf's genome. They just isolated those traits through intense selection pressure.
Okay, so the UTGH argues that human epigenetic adaptation works on that exact same principle.
Yes, but driven by extreme environmental disruption rather than human breeders. The human DNA already had the chapters written for high-altitude survival, cold weather survival, tropical
But
survival.
just needed the environment to apply the pressure.
Right, to turn those specific epigenetic volume knobs up to 11.
Okay, so to really see this epigenetic engine in action, we need to look chronologically at the very first group to face that kind of extreme environmental pressure.
Yes, we do.
And according to the text, that actually wasn't after the flood, it was before it. It was the dispersion of Cain's lineage.
Following the Genesis account, the UTGH framework notes that Cain's line was exiled eastward, and this is vital geography.
Why is that geography so important?
Because this exile pushed them out of the highly productive, stable lowland environment, which was this lush ecosystem where Seth's descendants lived, and forced them up into the elevated, rocky highland terrain.
Okay, so where exactly are we talking about?
We are looking at the Caucasus, the Zagros, and the Altai mountain corridors.
Oh, wow. So Cain's descendants basically got pushed into the harshest real estate available on the pre-flood Earth.
Absolutely brutal conditions.
Freezing temperatures, high altitude, incredibly tough physical terrain. And even with that pre-flood atmospheric shield you mentioned, being at a high elevation meant they were getting hit with way more UV radiation than the people down in the lowlands.
Right. The environmental pressure was immense and it was immediate. And this is exactly where the front-loaded genome goes to work.
So how does the body respond?
Well, cold's selected for thermal retention. Epigenetically, this triggers heavier body mass. It triggers shorter limbs to prevent heat loss and broad, barrel-shaped chests to keep the core warm.
So a completely different physical build from a lowland human.
Entirely different. Then you add the altitude, which selects for respiratory capacity. Because the air is thinner up there, the genome expresses enlarged nasal passages to warm and humidify that freezing air before it hits the lungs.
Makes total sense.
And then the rough terrain itself selected for incredibly robust skeletons and heavy muscle attachments, just to survive the daily physical toll of moving through craggy mountains.
And what about the UV exposure?
The higher UV exposure at that elevation selected for melanin retention, which means darker skin despite the pre-flood canopy.
Wait a minute, let me just think about this. Barrel chests, short limbs, incredibly robust skeletons, heavy brow ridges to support huge jaw muscles, and massive nasal passages.
That sound familiar?
Yeah, that is the exact anatomical description of a Neanderthal.
It is, and this is perhaps one of the most explosive claims in the entire UTGH framework.
A bet.
It argues that these physical adaptations we've just described are precisely what mainstream anthropology categorizes as completely separate species.
Homo neanderthalensis and the Denisovans.
Exactly. Under the UTGH model, they were not a separate evolutionary branch that diverged hundreds of thousands of years ago. They were a pre-flood highland community of humans, Homo sapiens, adapting rapidly to extreme mountain conditions.
Wait, hold on. The standard model dates Neanderthal remains to hundreds of thousands of years ago. They don't just guess those numbers right. They use radiometric dating, carbon-14, argon dating.
Right, the physics of radioactive decay.
Yeah. So how does the UTGH framework possibly reconcile the laws of physics with a 5,000-year timeline? You can't just ignore radioactive decay.
Well, the UTGH doesn't ignore the physics, but it fundamentally challenges the starting assumptions of radiometric dating.
Okay, how so?
Standard dating assumes a closed system, and it assumes a constant rate of decay over millions of years. It also assumes we know the exact initial ratio of parent-to-daughter isotopes in the rock when it formed.
Right, the baseline reading.
The UTGH argues that the cataclysmic nature of the flood, the rupture event, which we'll get to in a moment, involved massive subcrustal radioactive friction. Like tectonic plates grinding together.
Exactly. Plus intense piezoelectric effects from the crushing quartz in the crust. They argue this accelerated nuclear decay rates exponentially during the event itself.
Wow, okay.
Furthermore, they argue that the rocks created during this upheaval were born with mature isotope ratios already present. So if the starting assumptions about the clock are wrong...
The ages generated by the math will be wildly inflated.
Exactly. That's the argument.
Okay, so that's a massive paradigm clash on how to read the geological clock. But going back to the biology, it totally recontextualizes the whole caveman stereotype.
It really does.
Because if the standard model views Neanderthals as this distant kind of primitive cousin on a totally different branch of the family tree, UTGH views them as like the sibling who moved to the harsh mountains and got incredibly buff and cold adapted over just a few centuries.
And their housing situation actually reflects this too.
What do you mean?
Well, the standard model claims these cavemen lived in limestone caves for hundreds of millennia, right?
Yeah, the classic caveman image. But the UTJH points out a geological contradiction based on their own timeline. In the catastrophist framework, the vast limestone deposits on Earth, like the ones found in Europe where so many Neanderthal remains are discovered,
Right.
those are sedimentary layers deposited by the floodwaters.
Oh, so they couldn't have lived in them before the flood.
Exactly. Before the flood, these highland humans couldn't have been living in limestone caves because the limestone wasn't there yet. They were living in the exposed, ancient, rocky cratons.
Okay, let's define cratons for a second, just so we don't lose anyone. Cratons are the deep, stable, igneous bedrock anchors of the continental plates, right? The original crust.
Exactly, the solid granite foundations. So these populations lived on the hard rock of the mountains pre-flood.
And then what?
They only retreated into the freshly deposited soft limestone caves during and after the catastrophic flood event, as a desperate survival mechanism.
Oh, wow. So they weren't primitive cave dwellers by choice. They were survivalists seeking shelter in the mud during a planetary apocalypse.
Yeah.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual mechanism of that apocalypse. Because if the Neanderthals and Denisovans were highland humans, what happened to them when the global flood hit?
That's the big question.
And how does this explain the deepest genetic divergences we see in human populations today?
Right. So to understand the dispersion, we really have to understand the event that forced it. The UTGH calls this the rupture event, and they place it approximately 5,300 years ago.
And it wasn't just 40 days of rain falling from the sky.
No, not at all. The framework describes a pressurized subterranean ocean, often referred to in hydroplate theories, that literally exploded through the Earth's crust.
Like a planetary pressure cooker just blowing its gasket.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Supercritical water moving at hypersonic speeds, ripping a fissure around the globe. And the UTGH argues this rupture started at a specific geographical point near modern-day Iceland and Britain.
Okay.
The fissure then propagated southward and wrapped around the planet, causing massive geological upheaval, triggering volcanic activity, and ultimately flooding the Earth.
Just absolute chaos.
Complete devastation. Now, Noah's family survived on the Ark, eventually landing in the Ararat and Caucasus region.
Right.
But the UTGH posits a really fascinating mathematical and geographic reality here. They were not the only survivors.
Which is a huge deviation from the Sunday school version, which definitely implies it was strictly the 8 people on the boat who made it.
It is a massive deviation. The UTGH looks at the modern genetic and geographical data and argues that other populations, specifically those pre-flood highland humans who were already living at extreme elevations, managed to survive on the absolute highest ground.
Because they were furthest from the blast zone.
Exactly, the furthest from the initial North Atlantic rupture point.
Let's connect this to the bigger picture of our genetics today.
Ah.
Where does the framework say these high ground survivors ended up, and how does that actually map to modern populations?
This is where the UTGH maps genetic divergence against the geometry of a global catastrophe. If a blast starts at Iceland, the safest places are going to be natural elevation shelters at the maximum geographic distance from that point.
Geometrically opposite on the globe.
Right. And when we look at human populations today with the absolute deepest genetic divergence from the rest of the global population, where do we find them?
Where?
We find them in Aboriginal Australians. We find them in the Andaman Islanders in the Indian Ocean. We find them in Highland Papuans.
Wow.
And we find them in a specific Amazonian group known as Population Y, deep in the Brazilian interior.
Wait, all of which are geographically situated on the completely opposite side of the planet from the North Atlantic rupture point?
Yes.
That is a wild correlation.
It's pretty striking. Now, the standard model explains this deep genetic distance. For example, the 50,000 to 70,000 years assigned to Aboriginal Australians by proposing ancient out-of-Africa coastal migrations.
Right, the idea that small bands of humans slowly walked along the coasts of Asia all the way down to Australia tens of thousands of years ago.
Exactly. A journey that notably just happens to have left almost no archaeological trace along the route. But UTGH argues this deep genetic divergence isn't a signal of deep time, it's a signal of deep isolation.
Deep isolation.
Yes. These were pre-Ararat survivors who sheltered on high ground and were instantly cut off from the rest of humanity by the changing post-flood geography.
So they didn't slowly migrate there over tens of thousands of years. They were already there, riding out the flood on the peaks.
So that's the claim.
And there is a cultural memory aspect to this that really stood out to me in the sources. Anthropologists have cataloged over 200 flood traditions globally, right?
Yes, all over the world.
And the cultures in the Near East and the Mediterranean, who the UTGH says are the direct descendants of the Ark, they all have boat survival myths. Think of Gilgamesh, or obviously the Genesis account.
Right, the boat is central.
But the Aboriginal, Andaman, and Amazonian cultures, they specifically feature high mountain survival myths. Their ancestors survived by climbing the highest peaks or the tallest trees as the waters rose.
It is a profound alignment. The cultural traditions actually match the physical geography of their survival. But the genetics are where this debate gets really, really intense.
Right, and I have to play devil's advocate on the genetics here.
Mm-hmm.
Because if a mainstream geneticist looks at the DNA of an Aboriginal Australian, they see thousands of private genetic mutations that simply do not exist in European or Asian populations.
Right.
They run the math on the known modern mutation rate, how many errors happen per generation, and they say mathematically it takes 60,000 years to accumulate this many unique mutations.
Yep, that's the standard calculation.
So how does UTGH compress 60,000 years of mutations into just a few thousand years? You can't just wave a magic wand.
No, you can't. The UTGH argues that the standard model is actually misidentifying what it's counting. The standard model assumes the founding genome of humanity was relatively simple, so every genetic difference between an Aboriginal Australian and a European today is counted as a novel, post-flood mutation that took time to build.
But the UTGH says the genome was front-loaded.
Precisely. UTGH argues that the vast majority of those genetic differences aren't new mutations at all. They are preloaded variants, what geneticists call standing variation, that were already present in the founding population.
Oh, I see.
They were merely expressed and then locked into the population due to extreme geographic isolation and inbreeding among a small survivor group.
Okay, so what about actual new mutations?
The truly novel mutations, the genuinely new errors in the DNA that happened after the flood UTGH, says those only number about 6,000 to 7,000.
And does that math work out?
It does. That number perfectly aligns with a 5,000-year timeline under modern mutation rates.
Okay, I love the analogy of building a house for this. The standard model says, look at all these unique features. It must have taken thousands of years to manufacture all these custom bricks and beams from scratch.
Right.
And the UTGH says, no, they just took the massive mansion they already had and rearranged the furniture into a new floor plan.
That is exactly the core of the epigenetic argument. So, setting the stage, we now have Ark survivors disembarking in the Near East in the Ararat region, and we have these isolated highland survivors, the deep divergence populations, scattered on peaks around the globe.
Okay, so the board is set.
Right. So the next massive question is, how did the puzzle pieces come back together? How did the major lineages of modern humanity form and lock into their current geographic regions?
Well, according to the texts, Noah's descendants, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, began to multiply and disperse outward from the Ararat region. But to expand into Asia, Europe, and beyond, they couldn't just teleport. They had to migrate through specific geographic funnels.
And those funnels happen to be the exact same mountain corridors where the pre-flood highland survivors, the populations we call Neanderthals and Denisovans, had just ridden out the catastrophe.
Oh, man, so it sets the stage for a massive genomic family reunion.
Exactly. And the UTGH breaks down the geographic genetic map with incredible precision here. Let's look at the dispersal west first.
Okay, heading into Europe.
Right. The groups moving out of the Near East through the Caucasus Mountains, the Western Corridor, encountered the Neanderthal communities recovering in those highlands.
And what was the result of that reintegration?
Modern Europeans and Asians today carry 1% to 4% Neanderthal DNA, but minimal Denisovan DNA.
Because they took the Western path,
Yeah.
mixing with the Western survivors.
Exactly. Now look at the dispersal east. The groups moving through the Altai Mountains, the Eastern Corridor, encountered the Denisovan communities.
And the result of that merging.
Melanesians, Pacific Islanders, and some East Asians carry high Denisovan DNA, up to 4% to 6% in some groups.
So mainstream science looks at this genetic data and says, modern humans migrated out of Africa, encountered totally different archaic hominin species in Eurasia, and interbred with them.
Right, that's the standard narrative.
But UTGH is saying this wasn't interspecies breeding at all.
Yeah.
This was cousins finding each other after the apocalypse. It separated human populations reintegrating after a massive bottleneck.
They were all Homo sapiens. They just looked radically different because the Neanderthals and Denisovans had been expressing their cold weather, high altitude epigenetic programming for centuries pre-flood.
While the Ark survivors were expressing lowland traits.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. This window of reintegration didn't stay open forever. The sources point to a specific geological mechanism that eventually locked populations into their final continental positions.
Okay, what was the mechanism?
It revolves around a biblical figure named Peleg, born roughly 531 years after the flood.
Right. The text famously says, "In his days the earth was divided," which usually gets interpreted as the Tower of Babel language split, right? Like people stopped speaking the same language, so they scattered.
That's a very common theological interpretation,
Right.
but UTGH reads it fundamentally geologically and climatologically.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Following the rupture event, the world's oceans were incredibly warm due to the subcrustal heating and volcanic activity of the flood.
Basically boiling from the inside.
Right. However, the continents, which were now stripped of that protective greenhouse canopy, were incredibly cold.
Okay, let's look at the thermodynamics of that. You have massive hot oceans evaporating immense amounts of moisture into the air. And that moisture is blowing over freezing cold continents.
Yep.
That is the perfect recipe for a massive continuous snow machine.
It is the exact mechanism required to trigger a rapid post-flood ice age. Glaciers began building up on the continents at an astonishing rate.
Okay.
And when you lock up millions of cubic miles of ocean water in continental ice sheets, what happens? Sea levels plummet.
Right.
In the UTGH framework, sea levels dropped hundreds of feet, exposing massive land bridges worldwide. Beringia connected Asia to North America. The Sunda Shelf connected Southeast Asia to Australia. Doggerland connected Britain to Europe.
So this allowed the rapidly multiplying human populations who had just mixed in the mountain corridors to literally walk to almost every continent on Earth.
Exactly. But around the time of Peleg, the oceans finally cooled. The massive temperature differential stabilized, the hyperevaporation stopped, and the ice began to melt.
And all that water goes rushing back into the ocean.
The sea levels rose rapidly, completely submerging the land bridges. The Earth was literally physically divided by water.
The door slammed shut.
It slammed shut. The populations had mixed, they spread across the exposed land bridges, and then the rising oceans locked them onto separate continents and islands to face their new environments entirely alone.
This mechanism is crucial because it explains how unique physical traits became dominant in specific regions, right?
Exactly.
If a group gets locked in Scandinavia, their epigenetic volume knob turns up the traits for processing vitamin D in low sunlight, leading to pale skin. If a group gets locked near the equator, the knob turns up melanin production, and they are no longer mixing their genes with the global pool.
They are completely isolated, and this leads us to one of the most fascinating and extreme examples of physical adaptation in the source material.
What's that?
What happens when a human population gets locked into a highly restrictive, isolated island environment?
We have to talk about insular dwarfism. Let's look at the island of Luzon in the Philippines.
Let's do it.
In Calao Cave, archaeologists found the remains of incredibly small-bodied hominins. Now, the standard model looked at these bones, dated them to at least 130,000 years ago, and classified them as an entirely new primitive species.
Homo luzonensis.
Right.
They found tiny human bones and declared, based entirely on their evolutionary timeline, that this must be a divergent species that branched off before modern humans even existed.
But the UTGH framework points to a very well-documented, universally accepted biological mechanism called insular dwarfism.
Yes, let's explain the caloric math of this because it's fascinating.
Yeah, please.
When large mammals are trapped on islands with limited food, limited space, and no large predators, they shrink over successive generations.
It's an epigenetic survival mechanism.
Exactly. Less body mass means you need fewer calories to survive. If the island only produces enough food to support 50 normal-sized humans, they might starve.
Right.
But that same island can easily support 150 humans who are 3 feet tall.
It's just basic resource management by the genome. And the irony the UTGH points out is that the standard model completely accepts insular dwarfism for animals.
Oh, without question.
On the Channel Islands off California, paleontologists found the remains of mammoths that had shrunk down to the size of ponies.
Which is adorable, but also scientifically accepted.
Yeah. And on Flores Island in Indonesia, an ancient elephant species called the stegodon shrank dramatically. Mainstream science fully accepts this as environmental adaptation.
But when humans on Flores, the famous hobbits or humans on Luzon, shrank, the standard model abandoned the dwarfism explanation entirely.
And suddenly declare them entirely new, separate species.
Right. UTGH argues for biological consistency. If an elephant can shrink on an island without becoming a non-elephant, a human can shrink on an island without becoming a non-human.
That makes a lot of sense.
Homo luzonensis is not a separate evolutionary species. They are simply the pre-Austronesian human population of Luzon, responding to the intense caloric and spatial constraints of island isolation.
And what's amazing is that the modern genetics actually back this up, right?
Yeah.
Because there is a group of people living on Luzon today, the Ayeda Negrito people.
Yes, specifically a subgroup called the Ayeda Magbricon. They are a small-bodied indigenous population. And here is where the genetics perfectly align with the UTGH corridor model.
Tell me.
The Ayeda Magbricon alive today carry the absolute highest level of Denisovan DNA on Earth.
Wait, really?
Yes, roughly 30 to 40% more than even the Melanesians in Papua New Guinea.
Oh, wow. Let's trace that path then. They took the eastern corridor out of the Near East. They encountered the Denisovans in the Altai Mountains and absorbed their genes.
Right.
They migrated across the exposed sun-to-shelf land bridges during the Ice Age, all the way to the Philippines. And then Peleg's division happens.
The ice melts, the waters rise.
And they're stuck.
The UTGH argues this genetic signature proves they are the direct, unbroken, isolated descendants of that exact eastern corridor dispersal.
That is incredible.
They were preserved in what the author calls a bottle sealed by the sea. Their DNA didn't dilute with other migrating groups because nobody else could reach the island once the waters rose.
And their physical size shrank drastically due to the island environment forcing their epigenetic expression toward dwarfism.
Exactly. It's an incredibly cohesive narrative once you accept the timeline compression.
It really is.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, if islands make things smaller because of resource constraints, what about the opposite?
Ah, the giants.
Yes, the sources spend a significant amount of time talking about giants. And they don't treat them as mythological metaphors, right? They treat them as a biological reality.
I'm absolutely literal.
So how does UTGH explain the massive physical dimensions of the giants recorded in ancient texts?
This brings us to the final biological puzzle in the framework, gigantism, and intrinsically tied to it, the rapid decay of human lifespans post-flood.
Okay, let's get into it.
Ancient texts across multiple cultures mention pre-flood and immediate post-flood figures with massive statures. The biblical texts mention the Anakim, the Rephaim, and Goliath of Gath.
Right.
And they also record incredibly long lifespans. Noah lived 950 years. Adam lived 930.
Which, I mean, modern readers almost universally dismiss these numbers, right?
Yeah.
They say it's mythological exaggeration, or they try to rationalize it by saying, oh, they counted months as years.
Which doesn't work mathematically.
No, because you'd have patriarchs fathering children when they were like 5 years old.
Exactly. The UTGH takes these records as literal biological history, and it ties this gigantism and extreme longevity directly back to the conditions of the pre-flood atmosphere we discussed earlier.
It's the hypobaric chamber.
Yes. Remember that 1.8 atmospheres of pressure, the highly oxygenated UV-shielded sky?
The same atmosphere that allowed a 250-kilogram pterosaur like Quetzalcoatlus to take flight without breaking the laws of aerodynamics.
Exactly. The UTGH framework argues that the pre-flood Earth was a highly optimized, high-energy environment. It was the exact same atmospheric engine that allowed a 70-ton sauropod to pump thick blood all the way up a 10-meter neck to its brain.
Which is impossible today. Right.
Under our current atmospheric pressure of 14.7 psi, a sauropod's heart would effectively explode trying to overcome gravity and resistance to pump blood that high.
But at 1.8 atmospheres.
What 1.8 atmospheres, the external barometric pressure acts like a medical compression suit. It assists the venous return of blood to the heart and makes that massive physiology totally viable.
So just like the sauropods and the giant dragonflies of the ancient world grew to massive sizes because the atmosphere structurally allowed it,
Yeah.
human beings had the latent genetic potential for massive skeletal growth as well.
Yes, the human genome contained the epigenetic potential for immense stature, which was fully expressed in this optimized pre-flood environment.
That is wild.
They had the oxygen concentration to fuel massive muscles, they had the hydrostatic support of the dense atmosphere, and they had pristine DNA with incredible cellular repair mechanisms that weren't being bombarded by solar radiation.
But then the rupture event happened. The pressure cooker blew.
The rupture event shattered that perfectly balanced environment entirely. The subterranean waters were violently expelled, the atmosphere thinned out as the vapor canopy collapsed, instantly removing the UV shield.
So the radiation just starts cooking everything.
Yes. And furthermore, the UTGH proposes that the Earth's effective surface gravity actually slightly increased.
Wait, hold on. How does a planet's gravity just increase? Mass determines gravity, right?
It's about the concentration of mass and rotation. The UTGH posits that the expulsion of the massive subcrustal ocean caused the Earth's crust to collapse inward, reducing the planet's overall radius by about 46 kilometers.
Okay.
By the law of conservation of angular momentum, think of an ice skater pulling their arms in during a spin. As their mass compresses toward the center, they spin faster.
Oh, so if the Earth expels a massive layer of water and its crust collapses inward, the planet's radius shrinks. So it has to spin faster on its axis.
Exactly. And the UTGH claims this is why ancient pre-flood calendars, like those used by the early Egyptians, Babylonians, and Mayans, all originally used a perfect 360-day year.
But they did.
After the crust collapsed, the planet spun faster, shifting the year to 365.25 days. And a smaller, denser, faster spinning planet altered the effective surface gravity.
Man. So the biological compression suit is gone. The UV radiation is suddenly cooking their DNA. The oxygen levels drop, and they weigh slightly more.
The environment that supported giants was entirely destroyed.
And the genealogical records reflect this environmental collapse with a stark mathematical decay curve, don't they?
They really do. Noah lived 950 years because he was born and matured in the optimized pre-flood world.
Right.
His son Shem, who lived through the catastrophic transition, drops to 600 years. By the time you get to Peleg's generation, a few centuries later during the Ice Age, it's down to 239 years.
And then it just keeps dropping.
Within a few more centuries, it flatlines into the modern 70 to 120-year range.
It's not just a random assortment of mythical numbers. If you plot the lifespans of the patriarchs on a graph, it forms a perfect biological exponential decay curve.
UTGH argues this is a literal biological record of a pristine genome succumbing to progressive UV radiation damage and environmental degradation.
The epigenetic triggers for gigantism were slowly suppressed because the new environments just couldn't support massive bodies anymore.
Exactly. The DNA repair mechanisms were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of solar radiation, and the human lifespan collapsed to match the harsh new reality of the post-flood world.
It is a breathtaking reframing of everything we take for granted about history. Let's take a breath and recap this incredible journey, because we have covered an immense amount of ground today.
You certainly have.
We started with just 8 people surviving an apocalypse, carrying a pristine, front-loaded genome packed with the potential for infinite variety. We saw how the standard model looks at Aboriginal and Neanderthal DNA and assumes vast tracts of time, while the UTGH looks at the exact same data and sees rapid epigenetic expression driven by catastrophic isolation.
We tracked the post-flood reintegration as Ark survivors migrated through the mountain corridors, absorbing that rugged Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA,
Before the melting ice age raised the sea levels and slammed the geographic doors shut.
which isolated populations on islands like Luzon, forcing them to physically shrink to survive.
And finally, we saw how the collapse of the perfect pre-flood atmosphere slowly erased the giants from the Earth and crushed the human lifespan down to the fleeting century we get today.
It is a masterclass in how starting assumptions dictate your conclusions. If you assume slow, steady uniformitarianism, you get millions of years.
But if you assume a catastrophic rupture and a front-loaded genome, you get 5,000 years of chaotic, desperate adaptation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, regardless of which timeline you personally accept, the undeniable takeaway is the staggering resilience of the human genome.
Oh, absolutely.
It is a biological encyclopedia capable of adapting to almost any extreme this planet can throw at it.
And that leaves us with a final, slightly haunting thought to chew on. If the UTGH framework is right, and our DNA really is this massive front-loaded library,
Which is a big if, but go
right,
ahead.
it means we are currently only reading a few chapters based on our modern environment. So what unexpressed ancient adaptations are sitting dormant in your genome right now?
That is a fascinating question.
If the atmosphere shifted tomorrow or the UV radiation spiked, what would your descendants physically become in just a few generations? The blueprints might already be inside you. Keep questioning the ground beneath your feet, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.